Peyton and I are reading today from Hebrews chapter 5, verses 1 through 10. For every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to represent men in things pertaining to God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins. He is able to have compassion on the ignorant and on those who are wayward, for he himself is also subject to weakness. Because of this, he must offer sacrifices for his own sins, just as he does for the people. No man takes this honor for himself, but he who is called by God receives it, just as Aaron did. So also Christ did not glorify himself to be made a high priest, but it was he who said to him, "You are my son, today I have become your father." As he also says in another place, "You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek."
In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death. He was heard because of his godly fear. Though he was a son, he learned obedience through the things that he suffered. And being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation and for all those who obey him, being designated by God a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek.
This is our family time. This is a time that we celebrate as a church family, birthdays, anniversaries, housekeeping items, announcements, etc. Does anybody have a birthday or anniversary they would like to celebrate? Oh, you have a friend. All right. Birthday?
Yes, birthday. I am 19 on Tuesday.
Ooh. Birthday?
Yes. I'm 45 today.
Okay, happy birthday. All right, now we'll sing you a song. Happy birthday to you, to Jesus be true. May God richly bless you. Happy birthday to you. I have one announcement. If anybody else has an announcement, now would be the time to come forward. As mentioned, with Kara Alexander's passing away, her funeral will be next Sunday afternoon, and the Waves are looking for help with food. So if you are able to help with that, please let Margaret or Sherry Lee know. Any other announcements? Okay, this is the first Sunday. Nope, this is not the first Sunday. We're just doing kids worship today? Oh, all right. So it's not the first Sunday, but we're still going to do kids worship. So if you are in grade 5 or below, you are dismissed to go to kids worship, and we will be continuing with our service.
And by continuing, we mean it's sermon time, so I got to get up here. So as we continue through our sermon series through the book of Hebrews, we have these moments where we need to kind of recall back and pull back some stories from our Sunday school memory banks. And so there's two that we're going to need this morning that will be of particular help in understanding the text that Tricia and Peyton read for us today from Hebrews chapter 5. So if you've got Hebrews chapter 5 open, maybe put a thumb there and flip back to Exodus chapter 32. Now in Exodus 32, we have this interesting story where Moses goes up on the mountain to receive the 10 words, the covenant that is going to describe the relationship between Israel and their God. And so Moses goes up there. And for those of us that grew up in church, it's kind of like waiting for your parents to stop talking to the other adults before you can go back home. You probably will try that trick where you'll go sit in the car and wait, but your parents can way outwait that, and it gets way too hot in the car, so that doesn't last. But you'll say, how many more minutes? And they'll say, 15 more minutes. And you'll be, okay, 15 more minutes. And then that's when you learned how to read a watch. 15 minutes, watching that time. So Israel, the whole country, feels this way about Moses. He's up on the mountain, and they're like, so when is he coming back? And I feel for them, because as long as my dad would talk to people, he didn't ever do it for 40 days. So they were wondering what was going on by that point. When is he ever going to come back? And so, of course, as you recall, things get out of hand, and Aaron gets this other idea about, hey, listen, why don't we've lost Moses, and so we need an object to remind us of this worship. So let's make a golden calf. They take up a collection, and they make a golden calf. You could get that done in 40 days. And so there it is. And then in chapter 32, verse 7 and 8, we read, God tells Moses, go down, because your people whom you brought up out of Egypt have become corrupt. They have been quick to turn away from what I commanded them, and have made for themselves an idol cast in the shape of a calf, and they've bowed down to it. God goes on from there to say, listen, let's just start over. I'll kill those fools, and we'll start a whole new nation out of you. And Moses is like, whoa, pump the brakes here, God. In verse 11, he says, Lord, why should your anger burn against your people who you brought out of Egypt? It's interesting how he's trying to play that turn the tables thing on God. Remember your servant Abraham and Isaac and Israel, to whom you swore by yourself, I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars of the sky. I will give your descendants all this land I promised them, and it will be an inheritance forever. So Moses kind of takes the approach like, what will people think when they hear that Israel's been led into the wilderness and then was destroyed? Surely that's not the end that you intended for the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You've intended and promised so much more. And so, of course, that's exactly what happens. And so Moses goes down, and then Aaron tells his story about, we just kind of threw some gold in the fire, and then out jumped the calf. Like, okay, that's what you're going with? You had 40 days to come up with an excuse, and that was the best you came up with? Moses then calls out to the whole camp in verse 26, whoever is for the Lord, come to me. And the Levites rallied to him. Then he told them to arm themselves with swords, and they went back and forth through the camp, putting down some kind of rebellion, and 3,000 people were killed. In verse 28, we read, the Levites did exactly as Moses commanded, and that day about 3,000 people died. Then Moses said, you have been set apart to the Lord today, for you were against your own sons and brothers, and he has blessed you this day. Now, this is one of those Sunday school stories that we just don't know what to do with. It's a story that we just don't fully understand, and no doubt the violence likely offends us. But this marks the beginning of a unique relationship for that one tribe, the Levites. They then have a special relationship now, a special responsibility. From here on out, they are described as facilitating the tribal worship that Israel offers up to God. And Aaron and his family, even in spite of their failure, Aaron's descendants are specially marked to be high priests. Now, by the time Jesus comes along, in fact, after the exile, that process and that system has kind of broken down a bit. There's still Levites serving in the temple, even in Jesus' day, but the high priest role had lost the script, so to speak. The high priest had become a political office, like a peerage that would be handed down from within these families of privilege and power amongst the Sadducees. But like the Apostle Paul, the Hebrew writer here in chapter 5 of Hebrews reimagines the priesthood in the Christian community. He has a whole new idea, about what it's going to mean to be a priest. So last week, our text at the end of chapter 4 ended with these words, therefore, since we have such a great high priest who has ascended into the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith that we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weakness, but one who has been tempted in every way, yet without sin. So let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. And this line of thinking here at the end of chapter 4 continues right into chapter 5. In fact, this conversation goes all the way out to the end of chapter 10. It's a great big idea. And from it, the preacher suggests that the high priest now is supposed to be a person who is selected from the people, he says in chapter 5, verse 1. He represents the people before God by making sacrifices. He isn't going to be a guy that's proud because he also has his own sin to be atoned for. That's in verse 2. He's selected by God and not self-appointed. He was selected just the way Aaron was. And a good high priest is going to maintain that vertical relationship between God and the people, while at the same time maintaining this horizontal relationship between himself and the worshiping community. He will control his anger against his fellow humans, even if they're ignorant or deceived, because he too struggles with weakness. That's the kind of high priest that we need. That's the kind of high priest that we should get. And then the preacher makes a turn here in this line of argument, and he says, Jesus, who is recognized as the Son by the Father, and yet is still one with God, this Jesus is a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. Okay, well, what on earth is that? The Hebrew writer here is answering a question that we probably today had never even thought to ask. We've heard Jesus described as a high priest, for a long time, and it's never seemed to be an odd idea. But a Jewish listener, a person that's familiar with the Old Testament, of course, would have a very good objection to raise. How can Jesus be a priest, or even a high priest, if he isn't a member of the Levite tribe? Jesus, as is well known, is from the tribe of Judah, famously so. And so how can he be a priest? Because priests don't come from Judah, they come from the Levite tribe. So instead, what the Hebrew writer is suggesting here is there is this character Melchizedek that helps to make it clear. Now Melchizedek, that's another Sunday school story that we've got to go back and pick up in Genesis chapter 14. It's an amazing story. Great Sunday school material, great flannel graph work that you can do with this one. So Abram at this point and Lot, they separate and they go their separate ways, and Lot takes the good land, settles in Sodom, and then 5 kings in the area come over and they capture the king of Sodom and all the other kings in the valley and take away Lot and his whole family. Kidnap them all. And then when Abraham hears about this, he then calls out and he collects up a militia of 318 trained men from within his household. So that's crazy. I don't know how many people you could get in a pinch if you were needing to find some guys that knew how to fight. 318, that's amazing. So he takes these 318 guys, they go fight, and they get Lot and all his stuff back too, his whole family, and they return. Then in Genesis chapter 14, verse 17, we read, after Abram returned from defeating Chedorlaomer and the kings allied with him, the king of Sodom came out to meet him in the valley of Shavah, that is the king's valley. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of the God Most High, and he blessed Abram, saying, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and praised be the God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand." And then Abram gave Melchizedek 1/10 of everything. And so you probably know that this is the place where the idea of a tithe comes from. And this is this idea that Abram is recognizing the validity of Melchizedek's claim of being a priest of the Most High God, a priest of the Lord. Now from here, Melchizedek disappears. We don't ever hear directly from Melchizedek again in the Bible. Now his name is mentioned a number of times in the book of Psalms, and in fact, his name mentioned in Psalm 110 appears here in Hebrews chapter 5 in a quote that was read this morning. And yet we don't know anything else about Melchizedek. We don't know where he came from. We don't know his ancestors or what his lineage is. And then we don't know his descendants and what happened to them. He just kind of pops into our story seemingly out of nowhere, and then he just kind of disappears out of the story. Some Jewish traditions hold that Melchizedek never died, that he was kind of lifted up and brought up to heaven like Elijah. He is, however, mentioned as a priest of the Most High God, and this would be during Abraham's day. This has some interesting ramifications for our understanding of the biblical narrative. It suggests that God is out there doing work. He's out there amongst the other nations, doing things that we don't know about. Now, God is still working to restore all of creation through the covenant he made with Abram, but it appears that God's also being worshipped by other people. He's worshipped by the other nations in ways that we don't read about in Scripture. It's kind of mysterious. Melchizedek is part of who knows how many other priests that are worshiping this one true God. Melchizedek, the name literally means king of righteousness. And then he's also named as the king of Salem. And Salem's a Hebrew word for peace. So he is a king of righteousness, and he's a king of peace. This guy just seems perfect to represent somebody else I know. He was a priest even before Levi was named a priest. The Hebrew writer here is making the point that Jesus is a priest, but he's completely different, a completely different kind of priest, just like Melchizedek was. Jesus is a priest in the same way as Melchizedek, a completely different one. Unlike the Aaronic priests and unlike the Levites who serve as priests until they die, Jesus is a priest forever. Aaronic priests offered gifts and sacrifices, we read in Hebrews 5:1. And here the author focuses upon Jesus offering to God prayers and supplications as opposed to offerings. The Hebrew writer presents the priests as a bit stoic. They're definitely buttoned down, and they're offering these sacrifices, and they're not getting frustrated with the other people that sometimes make mistakes. But instead, the Hebrew writer describes Jesus is very passionate, much like what Doug described this morning. Jesus, in his exchanges with his mother, in his exchanges with his disciples and even his adversaries, he wasn't afraid to speak clearly and speak passionately and emotionally. He offered pleas and cries to God. And the Hebrew writer suggests that this desperation wasn't weakness, but instead was a strength. He was able to pray honestly and passionately to God his Father, and as a result, he was heard for that very reason. The preacher is suggesting here that God heard Jesus because of his reverence. And he goes on to imply more. Jesus was not, as the audience is well aware, delivered before his death, but Jesus was delivered after his death. That Jesus experienced what he knew to be true about God's ability to rescue out of death. And then we come to a really challenging text this morning. It comes in verse 8. Son though he was, he learned obedience from what he suffered, and once made perfect became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him. I got questions on just about every word in that sentence. So he was a son. How did Jesus learn obedience? Like, Jesus is perfect. He has God-like knowledge. He's like the one guy that never needs to learn anything because he already knows everything. He has perfect knowledge, and yet the Hebrew writer says he learned obedience through what he suffered, and once made perfect, became the source of eternal salvation. Now, if Jesus is becoming perfect, if Jesus is somehow learning obedience like he didn't already have it, doesn't that mess with a classic understanding of the divinity of Jesus? And then secondly, and perhaps even more importantly, I thought we were saved by grace. Yet the Hebrew writer seems to suggest here that we are saved by being obedient. So this is an interesting knot that's tied here in the text. And Luke Timothy Johnson, in his commentary, suggests that we need to consider for a moment the true nature of suffering and the true nature of obedience and what it really means to have faith. And so he backs out and gives like about 3-step logical argument. So rub your ears or kind of, wake yourself up here. We're going to go through like 3-stepper. And so stick with me here as we get through this. It starts with this premise that suffering is a matter of pain. So suffering is known because it's experiencing pain. And to experience pain, you need to be alive. Okay? Not necessarily sentient, but you need to be alive. Now consider how a stone may suffer blows. You can hit a stone with a stick or you can hit a stone with a chisel, but there's no indication that stones experience pain. And so in that sense, stones can't suffer. But people can, and animals can. So to experience pain, to suffer, you need to be alive. And we tend to think of pain in negative terms. And so it's something to be avoided at all costs. Our instinct is to think first in terms of suffering due to physical injury, or suffering due to disease, or suffering due to a wound that we've received by being hurt or attacked by somebody. It's suffering's all negative. And yet that isn't exactly true. If we expand out our experience of suffering, this characteristic of being alive, there are some examples of pain and suffering that aren't negative. A teenager might grow 3 inches over a summer. I did that between grade 10 and grade 11. And so you're going to feel some pain as a result of that, as your legs are getting far longer, far faster than your muscles can grow. An athlete feels pain when working out or training. And everyone in this room entered this world through the willingness of a woman to experience pain, or at the very least discomfort, that woman being your mother. All these forms of pain are no less real than negative ones. All these forms of pain suggest a broader understanding is necessary, that suffering comes in positive and negative experiences, and that pain is related to this. Pain and suffering are related to the increase of life, the expansion of life. Suffering comes when life grows and when life begins. And that's exactly what's meant here in verse 8, when the preacher uses a clever turn of phrase in Greek, emathein aph epathein. He learned from what he suffered. It's kind of like a no pain, no gain kind of phrasing. But what he's suggesting here, the Hebrew writer is suggesting what's true in the physical world is true in the spiritual world, that growth is good, but growth always comes in some way from a kind of pain. Even learning comes through pain. It comes through loss. Learning something new means setting aside something that you used to know, or setting aside another way of seeing the world. Learning and education comes and grows through these kinds of experiences. Here, the Hebrew writer is suggesting that obedience to God's direction is good for the body, good for the soul. We are conformed through our obedience, and our obedience to God brings growth, which sometimes will bring pain and suffering. Jesus plotted the path of spiritual growth and development, and it goes right through Pain Town. Jesus knew this for a fact because he experienced it himself. Now, of course, we are saved by grace through faith, but the Hebrew writer will remind us later that faith is more than just belief. Faith is more than just mental assent to a fact. He will write later that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the assurance of things not seen in Hebrews 11. But faith is more than just stick-to-itiveness. It's more than just perseverance, says the preacher. Faith looks like something. Here in chapter 5, he says, faith looks like obedience. Remember back in chapter 3? The Hebrew writer in chapter 3 is describing that wilderness generation, that group of Israelites that spent 40 years in the wilderness, and they were known for three things. They were sinful, they were disobedient, and they were faithless. So keep those three things in mind. Jesus then comes in chapter 4, and he is the opposite of all three of those things. In chapter 4, we learned that Jesus is without sin, that Jesus was obedient, and finally, that Jesus was faithful. These three things are combined to form an obedience through which Jesus was perfected. And so again, it helps to understand a little bit about the word. It's not so much that Jesus was flawed and then became unflawed and perfect, but think of perfection more in the terms of completion or graduation or being declared perfect through process. Jesus, fully human, performed faithful obedience in this world, and that looks like suffering. Jesus didn't just fail to make mistakes. His perfection instead was performed through suffering. Jesus suffered, and through that was perfected. And he calls you and I into a life just like that. Discipleship is a big thing right now. I don't know if it's a big thing for you if you're hearing it from all these other places, but for me and all my ministry friends, everybody's talking about discipleship. It's discipleship this and discipleship that, and get involved in discipleship. And it seems like everybody's got a book or everybody's got a curriculum or some sort of a program going on. Some way of leading us into a way of life that conforms to the example of Jesus and leads to spiritual transformation. But I think first, if we're really going to understand discipleship, Hebrews chapter 5 tells us we need a whole new imagination for what that might look like. Discipleship is not personal development. Discipleship is not personal development that comes through like me and Jesus kind of work. It is suffering with company. Discipleship is suffering with communion, and neither of those two things are our favorite thing, are they? We don't like suffering. We avoid suffering religiously, if you might say. We think of suffering as an entire, like a negative, under no circumstances positive. And the Hebrew writer says we need to expand our understanding of suffering. And we also need to imagine it as a communal experience, as something that we will experience during the week and share when we get back together again. Discipleship is this idea of purposeful suffering for the purpose of expanding holiness that's shared about together, not done on our own, not done quietly and not talked about, but instead something that we share with our spouse, something that we share with our brother or sister here, something that we share with a mentor here, or something that we can be honest about with a mentee, with someone we're leading along. The truth is that no human can step all at once into God's will. We can't just kind of click, check the box, and then be perfectly in God's will. For two reasons. One, God's call on us is new every day. God's going to call you to do something today that he may not call you to do tomorrow. God's call on us is new every day. And then secondly, humans can dispose of their freedom only moment by moment. In other words, I can only be obedient by being obedient. And then I'm going to need to demonstrate that again a little bit later. It doesn't count when you just do it once and never do it again. Obedience is practiced moment by moment. when we think of stepping into God's will